The Young and the Restless spoilers shock next week, August 25th to August 30th, 2025. Lily hadn't planned on confrontation that morning, but something about the way Holden Novak stood by the Chancellor Park fountain, too calm, too prepared, awakened the investigative fire that had been simmering beneath the surface ever since whispers of Cain's new ventures started surfacing. She had been through enough cycles of betrayal and redemption to know when a pattern was being replayed with new actors and just enough cosmetic changes to feign innocence. Holden, seemingly pleasant and always careful with his words, had emerged recently in her peripheral vision too often to be coincidence. It was as though he had been placed just close enough to Cain's affairs to answer questions, but never so close that anyone could prove he was involved. But Lily didn't want smoke and mirrors. She wanted truth. She demanded to know what Holden truly knew about her ex-husband's dealings. Her tone was crisp. Not emotional, not accusatory, but surgical. Holden's smile faltered for just a second, and in that flicker, Lily saw it, hesitation. He claimed that whatever Lily thought he knew about Cain's overarching financial schemes was a mistake. According to Holden, he was in the dark, just like everyone else, about any major plan that might implicate Cain or, worse, Colin. But Lily had lived through Colin's swindles before. She knew what they looked like. She knew how they bled into Cain's life, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. And she knew, with unshakable instinct, that this new wave of real estate maneuvers around Genoa City wasn't just aggressive expansion. It had fingerprints. What Holden underestimated was that Lily wasn't looking for a confession. She was reading patterns, words, pauses, redirected questions. And he had already revealed enough to make her certain that Holden knew more than he was saying. Whether or not he was directly involved, Lily understood now that Cain's world was far more layered than she had expected. And as the sun glared off the smooth surface of the fountain, she also realized that whatever truth she was chasing would not be found in polite conversation with Holden Novak. It would be found by pulling harder on the threads that tied her ex-husband to the legacy of deceit his father had perfected. Meanwhile, far from the curated calm of the park, Victor Newman was not interested in gentle confrontation. He had never been one for passive observations, and when patterns began forming around real estate purchases linked, however indirectly, to Cain Ashby, his instincts flared. The investments were too bold, too fast, and most importantly, too convenient. Victor had spent decades playing chess with men like Colin Atkinson, and he recognized the smell of a final con designed to launder dirty money through just enough legal structures to avoid suspicion. So, when he boarded the heritage train, where Cain had supposedly taken a nostalgic trip under the guise of business leisure, Victor brought with him not nostalgia, but a silent storm. He approached Cain with the quiet force of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make the ground shake. His accusation was surgical. All these real estate moves weren't just strategic, they were the aftermath of a massive, concealed con that Colin had pulled off in his final act, and Victor believed Cain was either complicit or naively being used as a funnel for billions born from deceit. Cain's defenses rose immediately, but Victor cut through them with brutal clarity. Every land transfer, every shell company behind those seemingly unconnected purchases, bore a pattern. One of Colin's old fingerprints was enough to make Victor question everything. The truth was simple: whether or not Cain wanted to be part of something dirty, he was part of it now. And Victor Newman didn't take kindly to his city being used as a money laundering playground. For Cain, the confrontation wasn't just about business. It was about legacy, identity, and the inescapable shadow of a father whose name still poisoned every chance he had at redemption. He had rebuilt his life many times over, tried to walk the fine line between ambition and integrity, but Victor's suspicion threatened to crush that fragile balance. The worst part was, Cain wasn't entirely sure he was clean. He had let things move quickly. He had trusted people to execute deals without auditing every layer. Somewhere deep down, a part of him feared that Victor might not be wrong. Elsewhere, another man was nursing a secret that had little to do with money but everything to do with trust. Kyle Abbott had been walking a razor's edge ever since he returned from Nice, and the longer he avoided the conversation with Claire, the more the weight of his guilt began to erode the foundation of their relationship. He had kissed Audra. It had been a calculated risk, a ploy to expose her intentions toward Victor, a maneuver designed to gather evidence that she was manipulating corporate allegiances for her own gain. But the kiss had happened nonetheless, and it hadn't been under surveillance or in a boardroom. It had happened in a hotel room, with Kyle wrapped in nothing but a towel and Audra at her most persuasive. Even though the moment meant nothing to him romantically, even though his motivations were pure by his own internal accounting, Kyle knew Claire deserved the truth. She had placed trust in him not just as a partner but as someone different from the parade of men who used excuses to hide behind convenient half-truths. And yet he delayed, afraid that context would be lost, afraid that what was technically not a betrayal might feel like one regardless. The problem wasn't whether Claire would forgive him. It was whether her image of who he was would survive the confession. And so Kyle avoided it. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He convinced himself it was strategic to delay, until Claire finally asked. Her voice was quiet but unyielding. She had sensed something for weeks. The way Kyle flinched when Audra's name came up. The way he sometimes retreated into thought during conversations that should have made him smile. Claire didn't come to accuse. She came to offer him the one thing he might not deserve, an opportunity to be honest before the truth found her through someone else. Is there something you haven't told me about Nice? She asked, her tone measured, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of emotional risk. Kyle froze. The room seemed to shrink around him. The truth balanced on the edge of his tongue, ready to fall or retreat. And in that moment, he realized that everything else, Victor's deals, Audra's games, even Cain's unfolding scandal, meant nothing if Claire couldn't look at him the same way after today. Because lies had a way of growing roots, and one kiss, however tactical, could blossom into the kind of silence that kills trust from the inside out. What none of them yet realized was that all these stories, Cain's financial scrutiny, Kyle's personal dilemma, Audra's manipulations, and even Victor's suspicions, were intersecting not just in consequence but in timing. Genoa City was entering a new cycle of reckoning. The people who had once relied on secrets and favors were being confronted by those who demanded truth, and those who feared exposure were being handed a final chance at redemption or ruin. Lily would continue digging, and eventually she would find that Holden's vague answers weren't a dead end but a map in reverse. Victor would escalate, and Cain would have to make a choice, stand against the weight of accusation and fight for legitimacy, or admit that some legacies aren't so easy to escape. Claire would wait, maybe just once more, for Kyle's truth, but the more he hesitated, the clearer it became that honesty wasn't just a moral test, it was the last chance to salvage something real. And Audra, restless, clever, dangerous, wasn't done playing yet. Her alliance with Kyle might be fractured, her standing with Nate unraveling, but Audra never lost quietly. If Kyle confessed, if Claire walked, if Victor's suspicion spread, she would become something far more dangerous than vindictive. She would become unanchored. And that's when the real storm would begin. Cain had convinced himself that what he was building in Genoa City was a rebirth, his redemption arc forged not in secrecy, but in strategy, and backed by someone who had spent decades navigating the darkest corners of finance. That someone, of course, was his father. Colin had been a con artist, a manipulator, a ghost in the wires of global schemes so convoluted that even the most seasoned investigators could barely trace the money once it moved past the third offshore trust. But Colin had also been a father, and in his final years, as his body failed and his hunger for the chase began to dim, he made a vow. He would leave Cain with something clean, something strong, legal, and permanent. A legacy not tainted by betrayal, but built from ashes into steel. The irony was cruel. For the first time in his life, Colin wasn't conning anyone. And no one believed him. Victor Newman certainly didn't. To Victor, the smell of Colin's past clung to the billions moving beneath the surface of Genoa City like oil slicking a clean river. The rate of real estate purchases, the shell companies sprouting like weeds across industrial zones, the the silent reshuffling of assets from old portfolios into new fronts. It didn't smell like ambition. It smelled like laundering. Dirty money was rarely injected all at once. It crept in quietly, whitewashed with just enough legitimate paperwork to pass cursory scrutiny. And Victor had seen this dance before. He had played it and won. But what enraged him was not just the suspicion that Cain was cleaning his father's final stash. It was the veneer of innocence Cain wore while doing it. Victor didn't care whether Colin had genuinely changed. Men like Colin rarely did. What mattered was the pipeline, and whether it was still open. When Victor confronted Cain aboard that old train, an ironically nostalgic setting meant to reflect the past being left behind, he brought no subtlety. His accusations were sharp and deliberate. Billions, he said, were moving not through the ambition of a businessman but through the machinery of a criminal operation long thought to be dismantled. He believed Colin's final con was already in motion and Cain was either the engine or the benefactor. Cain, to his credit, didn't flinch. But his silence said more than he intended. He didn't deny everything. He simply said Victor didn't understand the full picture. That phrase, the full picture, was enough to deepen the chasm of suspicion. Victor had built empires by understanding pictures before they were complete. If Cain thought ambiguity was a defense, he was playing chess with someone who always saw 12 moves ahead. Cain's challenge wasn't just external. Internally, he was unraveling. He had always wanted legitimacy, and in many ways, he believed he had finally achieved it. Colin had helped him structure it all, through the lens of legality, with ironclad paperwork and audited routes. The accountants were clean. The lawyers were top tier. But Cain couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep in the bones of the business, there was a lie he hadn't uncovered yet. Maybe Colin hadn't conned Cain. Maybe he'd simply omitted one final truth. Maybe the money had come from the wrong place. And if that was true, Cain's new world was a house built atop an invisible fault line. He told himself it was all above board. But his heart whispered doubts. Lily, far from this confrontation, had begun her own private investigation. She had tried to believe Cain's transformation. She had, at one point, even entertained the idea that people like him could grow beyond their upbringing. But Cain had grown distant again. He was making moves without sharing them, locking pieces of his plans behind tight-lipped conversations and half-smiles. Lily had seen that before. It was the look of a man carrying secrets, maybe not sins yet, but certainly shadows. And she refused to be blind again. Holden Novak was the name that kept appearing, never central, never in headlines, but always just off to the side, as if placed deliberately in the periphery. He was advising someone. Facilitating meetings. Signing documents on behalf of trusts that had no public face. Lily recognized the pattern. Holden was the hinge, the man who knew everything but claimed to know nothing. And so she decided to confront him directly, away from the boardrooms, away from the noise. In Chancellor Park, where the air still remembered legacy and betrayal in equal measure, Lily cornered Holden with the cold grace of someone who had stopped asking for truth and begun demanding it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I just want the truth," she told him, each word coded in restraint. Holden smiled with that lawyer's precision, the kind that bends without breaking. He denied involvement, of course. Said he didn't know what Cain's full plans were. Claimed he was just a facilitator, nothing more. But Lily saw through it. The problem with men like Holden was that they believed vague legalism could shield them from moral consequence. But she knew the signs. He was deflecting. He was lying, perhaps not with words, but certainly with omission. Holden's name was on paperwork linked to a land parcel that had tripled in value after a rezoning announcement. His LLC was tied to a holding company now renting office space to a venture Cain had quietly funded. None of it screamed illegal. But none of it passed the sniff test either. The more Holden denied, the more Lily pressed. She asked about the rezoning. About why a trust she traced back to Colin's Singapore account suddenly funneled funds into a local commercial development after a visit from Cain. She didn't accuse him outright. She asked questions only someone with deep insight could form. Holden's defenses grew brittle. He said she was connecting dots that didn't exist. But the sweat at his temple betrayed the truth: she had gotten too close. Back at Newman, Victor was escalating. He wasn't content with suspicion. He wanted confirmation. And so he launched a quiet internal audit. Not of Cain, but of the companies recently tied to Newman acquisitions. He traced every transfer, every invoice, every unexpected fee. He found a consulting firm with ties to Colin's old aliases. He found timelines that matched too perfectly with Colin's known activities in the final months before his disappearance. The money was there. Not all of it, but enough to seed doubt. Enough to force a reckoning. But what Victor lacked was a direct confession. Cain, when confronted again, doubled down. He said the money was clean. He said his father had given him advice, not a fortune. He said Colin was dead, and the past should stay buried. But Cain's voice lacked conviction. And that was all the confirmation Victor needed. He didn't need a signed statement. He just needed the leverage to turn perception against Cain in the eyes of the business community. For Cain, the walls were closing in. He hadn't told Lily the full truth. He hadn't told her how close Colin had been to the planning. How some of the capital may have originated from accounts Cain never fully audited. He thought it didn't matter. He thought his intention would be enough. But now, between Victor's accusations and Lily's quiet fury, he understood: intention doesn't erase origin. If even $1 of his empire was poisoned, the whole structure could collapse. And Colin? Whether he was alive or dead, his ghost was doing what it had always done best: complicating everything.